गाइस तो वेलकम बैक टू माय लाइव स्ट्रीम। और आज की लाइव स्ट्रीम के अंदर हम लोग ये तो पढ़ेंगे, ये तो करेंगे सारा चीज का एनालिसिस के बाद ये वाली बुक पढ़ना स्टार्ट कर। देख पा रहे हो ये वाली, रिटन बाय क्लास। ठीक है गाइस, और इसका समरी भी एंड में दूंगा। आज पूरी खत्म नहीं होगी, 2-3 दिन लगेगा, लेकिन समरी भी उसका देख। फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल हम लोगों ने कल ये वाला एंट्री पढ़ा था ब्लाइंड स्पॉट का। मैंने बोला था यहाँ से डाउन आएगा, जो हम लोग ये एंट्री भी पकड़ सकते थे, और यहाँ से एक बाई का एंट्री भी पकड़ सकते थे। और अभी तो ये सब हो गया है, तो अभी मैं सारा तो नहीं रिमूव करूंगा। जो इम्पोर्टेंट चीज़ है वो तो रखूंगा। जो वो था वो निकाल दिया, जो काम का नहीं था वो चीज़। ठीक है भाई, तो फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल मैं आता हूँ 1 आवर के अंदर। और वो सॉरी, डेली में देखता हूँ। मैं डेली रिजेक्ट तो डेली है, यस है। 4 घंटे का क्यूएम है, यस है। बाई साइड का क्यूएम है, नो नहीं है। बाई साइड का क्यूएम किसके ऊपर बनेगा, इसके ऊपर बनेगा। और तब तक के लिए सेल कहाँ तक आ सकता है, यहाँ तक आएगा। और यहाँ बहुत स्ट्रॉन्ग बाइंग बढ़ी है, बहुत स्ट्रॉन्ग बाइंग बढ़ी है, ध्यान रखना। नेक्स्ट चीज, 4 घंटे में कोई भी पीओआई दिखे नहीं, तो हम लोग आ गए अभी 1 घंटे के अंदर। 1 घंटे के अंदर यहाँ पे देखो, एक सीमेंट ये ट्रायंगल जैसा फॉर्म कर रहा है 2 दिन से। तो अभी हम लोग क्या करेंगे ये बताओ, क्या करेंगे ये बताओ। वेट करेंगे, छोड़ दो। गोल्ड ट्रायंगल जैसा पैटर्न फॉर्म बना रहा है, तो इनको छोड़ दो। एक्सपेंशन आने चाहिए, यहाँ पे हायर टेम्परेचर का रेंज फॉर्म होता है। हायर टेम्परेचर का ये एक्सपेंशन था, ये पूरा रेंज फॉर्म हुआ है। देख सकते हो क्या क्या हो रहा है, रेंज फॉर्म है। तो रेंज क्या करेगी, उसके बाद हम लोग इसके अंदर ट्रेड करेंगे। तब तक के लिए गोल्ड में नो व्यू है हमारा, गोल्ड के अंदर नो व्यू है हमारा। छोटा मोटा आ सकता है, लेकिन कोई फिक्स साइड बनने दो। फिक्स साइड कुछ बनने दो, तभी मजा है। या फिर इसका लिक्विडिटी लिक्विडिटी खेलेगा, और तो क्या करें। इसका लिया, इसका लेगा, इसका लेगा, फिर उसका लेगा वैसे। गोल्ड का तो अभी चलो छोड़ो, अच्छा खासा नहीं है गोल्ड। बीटीसी सेलिंग आया मैनिपुलेशन इस जोन से, ऑलरेडी था इस यहाँ पे यहाँ पे सेल कर सकते हो इस जोन से, पूरा सेल। 3-3% नीचे आई, पूरा मैं बोला तो सही थी, यहाँ तक तो आएगा ही आएगा। अभी मार्क करता हूँ मैं कि क्या सीन है इसका। से तो यहाँ तक है, ओवरऑल यहाँ तक। तो यहाँ तक दिख रहा है 1,03,000, 1,03,000 दिख रहा है। सही हो रहा है, फाइन था। ओके, श्योर। तो मार्क करते छोड़ो ये, छोड़ो ये, छोड़ो ये, को रखो। SNRC, SNRC 1 का सेटअप फॉर्म हो रहा है यहाँ पे, यानी कंटिन्यूएशन, सपोर्ट एंड रेजिस्टेंस कंटिन्यूएशन वाला सेटअप फॉर्म हो रहा है, तो क्या व्यू होगा? बीटीसी एक्सयूएसडी का एनालिसिस हो गया, लाइव स्ट्रीम भी स्टार्ट कर दिया। मैं देख पा रहे हो क्या सीन है? 1 घंटे में भी सेम सीन है कि यहाँ पे सेलिंग आएगा। उसके बाद मेरा एनालिसिस होगा, उसके बाद ये पढ़ना स्टार्ट करेंगे। दो चीज का एनालिसिस हो गया। जीबीपी का क्या सीन है? सेलिंग था पूरा, इस जोन तक लग रहा था, वो आ गया इस जोन तक। इसको तो अभी सब रफ ही करना पड़ेगा, कुछ खास नहीं था अभी। चलो डील ये तो हो गया है, ये एंटी निकाल दो। कहाँ तक आएगा? ओवरऑल तो सेल ही है, जब तक डेली रिजल्ट डेली नहीं करेगा तब तक। ठीक, यहाँ पे एक फॉर्म बन रहा है सेटअप जैसा कुछ। वैल्यू पूरा सेल है, 4 घंटे में पूरा सेल है। देखो ओके फाइन। तो अभी या तो इस जोन से बाई आएगा, की टाइम्स पे बाय देखना, ठीक है? की टाइमिंग्स पे बाय देखना, या फिर इस जोन ऊपर जाके इस जोन से सेल आएगा। ये पैटर्न उल्टा कर दो, ये पैटर्न उल्टा कर दो। सब कुछ डल से इसने डाउन दिया, यह तो सही है। चलो देखता हूँ क्या सीन है इसका। ऑर्डर टैप होने दो, यहाँ से रिजेक्शन है, ऑर्डर से रिजेक्शन है, वही सेम है। एसडी भाई साहब, एसडी जेपीवाई आ गया ऊपर, इसका स्टार्ट हो गया रैली है ऊपर। 4 घंटे पे देखा जाए तो रिजेक्शन का जोन ये बनेगा। तो ऊपर की साइड का ही है। डेली में क्या सीन है? डेली का क्यूएम हो गया है, प्राइस अभी ऊपर जाएगा, सीधी सी बात है। क्यूएम यहाँ से एंट्री ऊपर था, ये 4 घंटे में। तो यहाँ पे एक एंट्री देखो, देख पा रहे हो, ये बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट एंट्री है। तो ये एंट्री बनेगी एसएनआर से हम 4 घंटे का। तो अभी देखते हैं इसका कि भाई तू नीचा मेरा सेटअप फॉर्म कर, या फिर डायरेक्ट मैं एंट्री लूंगा, नहीं कंटिन्यूशन पे एंट्री। यहाँ तक जाएगा बस। यूरो का क्या सीन है? यूरो तो करते नहीं है हम लोग, इसका CHF का इसका छोड़ो। पर आपको करना है डेली में ट्रेडिंग। QM हो गया है अभी। QM हो गया है तो यहाँ तक आने का आएगा। की लेवल्स मार्क कर लो, ठीक है गाइस। की लेवल्स मार्क कर दो, जो जो भी मैं देखता हूँ वो मार्क करते रहो। इम्पोर्टेंट पॉइंट। हैंडल किस तरीके की फॉर्म होगी वही मैं बता देता हूँ। फिर आपको चाहिए क्या ये बताओ मुझे। हैंडल किस तरीके का रिएक्शन देगा, किस तरीके का मूवमेंट देगा, वही मैं बता देता हूँ कि यहाँ पे हाई बनेगा, यहाँ पे लो बनेगा। तो उससे ज़्यादा चाहिए क्या आपको। चलो ठीक है गाइस, तो सारा का सारा एनालिसिस कर दिया है हमने। गोल्ड के अंदर नो व्यू है। BTC के अंदर सेलिंग का व्यू है, लेकिन यहाँ पे अभी हमको ठहरना है। GBP USD के अंदर दोनों साइड देखो, कौन सी जगह की लेवल टैप होता है वो हमको ध्यान में रखना है। पहले ये नीचे वाला होगा टैप, ये वाला नीचे वाला होगा तो ऊपर जाएगा, और ऊपर वाला टैप होगा तो नीचे आएगा। GBP JPY में भी शायद से सेम सीन है। GBP JPY में वेट कर लो, ऊपर वाला ये हर्डल टैप होने का, क्योंकि ओवरऑल डाउन का है और डेली रिजेक्ट डेली दिया नहीं है। डेली रिजेक्ट दिया था ही, इसका छोड़ दो। GBP JPY छोड़ दो, ये कर सकते हो अभी ट्रेड यहाँ तो ऊपर तक, लेकिन यहाँ से आप लोग एक बाय कर सकते हो। ये बाय बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट रहेगा इस जोन से। SNR वन वाले जोन से बाइंग अगर आता है तो बहुत ही अच्छा ऊपर तक जाएगा। हाँ, यूरो JPY तो हम लोग ट्रेड नहीं करते, और CHF का डाउन साइड सबका मैंने व्यू बता दिया। गोल्ड अभी साइड में है तो गोल्ड का व्यू नहीं बता रहा हूँ मैं। कंसोलिडेशन हो रहा है, घंटे में कुछ नहीं फॉर्म हो रहा है, तो ऐसे में ट्रेड लेना क्या फायदेमंद है? बिल्कुल नहीं। बिल्कुल फायदेमंद नहीं है ऐसे ट्रेड लेना, इसलिए आप लोग जाओ आराम करो गोल्ड वाले। देखते हैं गोल्ड के अंदर क्या होता है। चलो भाई, तो सारी चीज का एनालिसिस कर दिया, क्लियर उसी मार्क। भी देखो content highlight why a new thinking methodology. The market is always right. There is unlimited potential for profit and loss. In the market environment, reasons are irrelevant. The three stages of becoming a successful trader, the dynamics of goal achievement, the steps to success and so okay, मैं पहले स्टार्ट करता हूँ द डिसिप्लिन ट्रेडर. द डिसिप्लिन ट्रेडर डेवलपिंग विनिंग एटीट्यूड. मार्क डगलस डगलस New York Institute of Finance. To call love for her love, understanding and being there throughout the process of writing this book. Contents में है पर preface, acknowledgements, forward, introduction है part 1 पे introduction why I wrote this book, why a new thinking methodology. Part 2 में है the nature of the trading environment from a psychological perspective. Third chapter, the market is always right. There is unlimited. Fourth chapter, there is unlimited potential for profit and loss. Prices are in a perpetual motion with no defined beginning or ending. The market is an unstructured environment. In the market environment, reasons are irrelevant. The three stages to becoming a successful trader. Part 3, building a framework for understanding ourselves. Ninth chapter, understanding the nature of the mental environment. 10th chapter, how memories, associations, and beliefs manage environmental information. 11, why we need to learn how to adapt. The dynamics of goal achievement, managing mental energy, techniques for effecting change. Part 4, how to become a disciplined trader, the psychology of price movement, the steps to success, a final note. First of all, forward preface and forward preface and acknowledgements. I'm going to skip this part. Now I directly starts from part 1 introduction part. Okay, guys. So part 1 introduction part, chapter 1, why I wrote this book. So since I started working on this book in the summer of 1982, nearly every dimension of futures trading has exploded in growth. There are brand new exchanges, new contracts, more advisory and news services, an increasing variety of books and publications, and ever more sophisticated technical trading systems. Most of all them with computer applications to make it easy to track the markets. ये कहना क्या चाहता है कि इन्होंने जब ये बुक लिखना स्टार्ट किया था तब बहुत सारे नई 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 एक्सचेंजेस आ रही थी, कॉन्ट्रैक्ट्स का सब नया नया आ रहा था, नई नई सर्विसेज मिल रही थी, बुक्स बहुत सारी बुक्स मिलनी स्टार्ट हो गई थी और पब्लिश हो रही थी. टेक्निकल वो क्या कहते हैं टेक्निकल ट्रेडिंग सिस्टम्स भी वहाँ पे आ रही थी और वो सारी की सारी टेक्निकल सिस्टम्स पीसी कंप्यूटर बेस्ड एप्लीकेशन के अंदर थी, एप्लीकेशंस के अंदर थी जिससे मार्केट को इजीली ट्रैक कर पाए. So, however, even with these tremendous growth in services related to trading, one inevitable fact remains: there is still a very small group of sophisticated traders who take the great percentage of profits out of the market. इन सारी चीजों का होने के बावजूद बहुत ही छोटा सा ग्रुप था, छोटा सा संगठन था, वो ही प्रॉफिट कर पा रहा था, समझे. और वो making well over 90% of all the other traders net losses year in and year out. 90% पैसा वही अपने पास रख रहे थे, वही बना रहे थे पैसे. 90% पैसा, 10% दूसरे लोग बना रहे थे, वही 90% बना रहे. So in future trading, for every dollar of profit gained by one trader, there has to be an equivalent dollar lost by another trader. ट्रेडिंग के अंदर क्या होता है, अगर हमने एक $1 हमको मिला है, इसके पास $1 गया हो, अभी हमारे पास $1 आया है, ये जीरो सम गेम है, जीरो सम गेम। If a few traders are consistently making money on a grand scale, then their profits have to be coming directly out of the pockets of thousands of other traders who very faithfully contribute to their daily winnings. अगर कोई बहुत सारा पैसा बना रहा है ना, तो उसके पास वो पैसा हजारों ट्रेडर्स के खींचे यानी गजबों में से आ रहा है, पॉकेट में से आ रहा है उसका, उसके पास उससे पैसा। Some of these very successful traders are public figures, but most are only known in the Chicago or New York area. ये सक्सेसफुल ट्रेडर्स पब्लिक फिगर्स होते हैं और ये ज्यादातर शिकागो और न्यूयॉर्क के अंदर दिखते हैं। Need less to say, need less to say, everyone want to know what they do and how they do it. वो बहुत कम बोलते हैं और लोगों को देखना है कि वो क्या करते हैं और कैसे करते हैं। There must be a difference between these two groups of traders, the small minority of winners and the vast majority of users who want to know what the winners do. छोटा ग्रुप है जो प्रॉफिट कर पा रहा है और बहुत प्रॉफिट है, इतना प्रॉफिट है। बड़ा ग्रुप है और प्रॉफिट इतना है। तो ये बड़ा ग्रुप को जानना है कि ये मतलब छोटे नहीं बोल सकते हम लोग, ये छोटा सा ग्रुप क्या कर रहा है, ये इनको जानना है। The difference is that the traders who can make money consistently on a weekly, monthly and yearly basis are trading from the perspective of a mental discipline. ये लोग जो पैसा बना रहे हैं ना छोटा ग्रुप, वो मेंटली डिसिप्लिन्ड ट्रेडर्स, मेंटली डिसिप्लिन्ड ट्रेडर्स हैं। uh, when asked for their secret of success, they categorically state that they didn't achieve any measure of consistency in getting wealth from trading until they learned self-discipline, emotional, and the ability to change their mind to flow with the markets. वो जब पूछा गया कि उनके सक्सेस का सीक्रेट क्या है, तो वो बोल रहे हैं कि मेरा कोई मतलब वास्ट एक्यूरेसी वाले कोई सेटअप्स नहीं है। वो बोल रहे हैं कि हम लोग सेल्फ डिसिप्लिन है, उन्होंने इमोशन कंट्रोल कर दिया है और उनको प्राइस के मूवमेंट के साथ उनको अपना माइंडसेट चेंज करना आता है। समझे, उनको प्राइस के साथ उनका माइंडसेट यानी मार्केट के साथ वो अपना माइंडसेट को भी ऐड कर देते हैं। First, I want to point out that self-discipline, emotional control, learning to change one's mind after making a commitment are all psychological issues that have nothing to do with news services, advisory services, new exchanges, or technical or fundamental trading system, computerized or not. ये मतलब सेल्फ डिसिप्लिन, इमोशनल कंट्रोल, लर्निंग टू चेंज अवर माइंड साइड, ये टेक्निकल्स पे नहीं आता, ये हमारे अंदर होता है, हमको लाना पड़ता है। इसलिए ये नहीं होता तभी आदमी फेल होता है। डिसिप्लिन, इमोशनल कंट्रोल और लर्निंग टू चेंज माइंड से अपने माइंड को भी चेंज करना पड़ता है एज पर कंडीशंस। सो second, from my trading experience, observation, and research, I have discovered that all traders, both winners and losers, seems to share some very common experiences. ये बोल रहा है कि उनके एक्सपीरियंस के हिसाब से इन्होंने विनर्स और लूजर्स को कहते हुए देखा है, मतलब शेयर कर बहुत ही कॉमन एक्सपीरियंस, शेयर एक्सपीरियंस यानी का वो समझो ना, थोड़ा इंग्लिश 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 आता है भाई, थोड़ा हिंदी कमर, थोड़ा ऐसा अनुभव, उनका अनुभव ये कहता है क्या दोनों का बहुत ही कॉमन एक जैसा अनुभव रहा है, either in the beginning or at the same point early in their trading career. या तो उनके करियर, उनके स्टार्टिंग में, या फिर उनके करियर के अंदर ऑलरेडी एक्सपीरियंस कंफ्यूजन, फ्रस्ट्रेशन, एंग्जाइटी एंड द पेन ऑफ द फेलियर। सारे के सारे ने कंफ्यूजन फेस किया है, फ्रस्ट्रेशन देखा है, एंजाइटी देखी है, और पेन ऑफ फेलियर्स भी उन्होंने देखा हुआ है। The few traders who pass through these ways to accumulate wealth are those who eventually confront and work through some very different psychological issues about what it means to be a trader. And this process of realization and the change normally takes several years even for the best of them. और जिसने भी ये फेजिस के अंदर आए हैं, उन लोग को इससे बाहर निकलने में कई साल भी लग जाते हैं। बोलने भले ही वो एकदम दिमाग के शातिर हो, कैसे भी हो, एकदम होशियार, फिर भी सालों के सालों लग जाता है। If self-discipline and emotional control are the key to success, they are also not necessary traits any of us are born with. ऐसा नहीं है कि ये सेल्फ डिसिप्लिन और इमोशनल कंट्रोल हमको जन्म से ही मिलता है। ऐसा नहीं है, हमको लाना पड़ता है। ऑन द कॉन्ट्ररी दे आर कैरेक्टर On the contrary, they are characteristics we acquire by learning certain mental skills. ये चीजें सेल्फ कंट्रोल एंड इमोशनल कंट्रोल, सेल्फ डिसिप्लिन, इमोशनल कंट्रोल, ये सब हमको सीखना पड़ता है, हमारी लाइफ के अंदर सीखना पड़ता है। Acquiring these mental skills is often the result of a trial and error learning process that can be very costly financially and usually by filled with emotional pain and suffering. ये चीज सीखने में बहुत ही पैसा लग जाता है, फाइनेंस लगता है, मेंटल स्ट्रेस आता है बहुत सारा, बहुत ही पेन होता है। अ, उसके बाद हम ये सीख सकते हैं। द बिगेस्ट प्रॉब्लम विद ट्रायल एंड एरर, मतलब ये ट्रायल एंड एरर करके ही हमको आएगा, तब तक नहीं आएगा जब तक ट्रायल एंड एरर नहीं होगा। The biggest problem with the trial and error approach in trading is that most people lose all their money before they get through the process. Most यानी 90% लोग ट्रायल एंड एरर फेस के अंदर ही इतना सारा पैसा घुमा देते हैं। And other traders who have enough money to keep on trading never fully recover from the effect of the psychological trauma they have inflicted on themselves to ever learn how to trade successfully on a consistent basis. This leaves only a relatively small number of people who make it. तो इससे हम लोग जान सकते हैं कि बहुत ही कम अमाउंट, बहुत ही कम लोग इसके अंदर सक्सेसफुल होते हैं। All the great traders, both past and present, have found it very difficult to explain what it is they do. करंट के ट्रेडर्स और पुराने ट्रेडर्स कोई भी अच्छे से नहीं बता सकता, अच्छा नहीं, अच्छे से नहीं बता पा रहा है कि वो लोग क्या करते हैं, कैसे करते हैं। एंड उससे भी ज्यादा ज्यादा का स्टेप, उन्होंने जो जो भी आगे बढ़ने के लिए स्टेप्स लिए हैं, कदम आगे बढ़ाए हैं, वो वो आसानी से नहीं शेयर कर पाते, और कहाँ से उन्होंने सीखा वो नहीं कह पाते। Many would gladly share with others that what they know about the market and its behaviors, but not necessarily about their behaviors as individuals. They would, however, often caution those who saw short their wisdom to understand that all the market knowledge in the world won't do them any good until they learn what can be called self-discipline and emotional control without necessarily being able to explain what they were. सो दुनिया का सबसे बेस्ट नॉलेज ले लो मार्केट के अंदर, बहुत एकदम तगड़ा से तगड़ा नॉलेज ले लो, फिर भी फिर भी आपने आपको सेल्फ डिसिप्लिन और इमोशनल कंट्रोल सीखना ही सीखना पड़ेगा, सीखना ही सीखना पड़ेगा। अगर ये नहीं सीखा, और जितना भी बेस्ट से बेस्ट नॉलेज ले लो भाई, वही फायदे का। फॉर इंस्टेंस, कट योर लॉसेस शॉर्ट, is a great advice that is often given as an action of trading wisdom. छोटा सा छोटा लॉस काटना सीखो, छोटा लॉस काटना सीखो. But how do you explain to someone the steps needed to learn how to do that? अगर आपको ये चीज किसी को सिखाना है तो कैसे सिखा सकते हो? Especially when he is interacting with an environment that is perpetually in motion and will always offer him the possibility that the market can come back and make him whole if he is in a losing trade. कैसे और स्पेशली ऐसा आदमी हो जिसको लगता है कि ये पूरा का पूरा रिकवर करेगा प्राइस और उसका लॉस चला जाएगा और वो प्रॉफिट में आएगा, उसको कैसे ये बताओगे कि छोटा स्टॉप उस पे काटे, छोटा लॉस पे काटे? If you take into consideration that his money and self-esteem are at stake and the market coming back is always a viable possibility regardless of how remote it may be, then you can see how difficult it is to explain why he needs to cut his losses. It is even more difficult to explain how he can do it in a way that suits his unique psychological makeup. कैसे इसको समझाओ, कैसे इसको समझाओ, वही तो इम्पोर्टेंट चीज है. The easiest way to explain how to apply this type of wisdom without actually explain it at all is to say, well, if you want to be, you need to learn self-discipline and emotional control. एकदम आसान सा तरीका है इसको सॉल्व करने का. हम अपने आप को समझाना पड़ेगा कि हमको सक्सेसफुल ट्रेडर बनने के लिए सेल्फ डिसिप्लिन और इमोशनल कंट्रोल सीखना ही पड़ेगा. I don't believe this type of back advice was intentional, however, for principally two reasons. First, self-discipline and emotional control are abstract concepts that are not easily explained or understood. We all hear or read the words a lot, but ask anyone you know to define either two of these concepts and you will probably get a blank stare. ये कॉन्सेप्ट्स, ये चीजें समझो, ये चीजें बहुत इजी है बोलने की. सेल्फ कंट्रोल, सेल्फ डिसिप्लिन और इमोशनल कंट्रोल का कैसे किया जाता है ये पूछो किसी से तो इसका आंसर किसी के पास नहीं है. बहुत कम लोगों के पास इसका आंसर है. Second, today's successful traders started out their journey without maps, signposts, or guidelines, or the benefits of knowing exactly where they had to end up. From a psychological perspective, to accumulate their fortunes, they had to explore the trading world through means of self-reflection and readjustment that was very demanding and time-consuming. One could say they more or less stumbled through it, learning from each mistake, many small and others that were devastating both financially and emotionally. At some point, they probably realized that something about themselves had changed because the normal kind of market activity at once had a very like anger, stress, anxiety, and fear just didn't have that same effect any longer. They must have gained some measure of confidence in themselves to respond appropriately to all possible market conditions because there is a direct correlation between a person's levels of confidence and the negative emotions mentioned. Confidence and fear are states of mind that are similar in nature, only separated by degree. As a person's level of confidence increases, his or her degree of confusion, anxiety, and fear dissipates proportionately. This confidence would naturally develop as people learned by trust themselves to do whatever needed to be done without hesitation. As a result of this kind of self-trust, they would no longer need to fear the seemingly unpredictable and erratic behavior of the markets. However, the main point I am making here is that the process of changes that took place was in the mental environment and psychological makeup of each individual trader. The markets didn't change, the tools that were used didn't change, the trader did. Now, when traders go through a transition in their personal development and learn a new skill on a trial and error basis, it is unlikely that they will keep a detailed record of the steps or to that learning process, especially if that process was characterized by pain, anxiety, and frustration. Obviously, if someone doesn't know exactly how they acquired the skills they now have, then naturally it would be extremely difficult for them to explain how someone else how they got them. यानी कि अगर मेरे पे सेल्फ डिसिप्लिन इमोशनल कंट्रोल की स्किल्स है और वो मेरे को नेचुरली मेरे को मिली है, तो मैंने सीखा नहीं है, मेरे को नेचुरली मिली है या फिर ऐसे ट्रायल एंड एरर करते-करते मैंने अपने आप सीख ली है, तो मेरे को समझाना नहीं आएगा। ऐसा सेम चीज़ है यहाँ। Besides, when it comes to trading, once someone is making the kind of money he had always dreamed of, there isn't much incentive to spend the time and energy necessary to break down these abstraction skills into an effective learning process from which others can derive some benefits. Developing educational programs to learn how to become successful traders required a completely different set of skills from the skills necessary to be a trader. ये कहना चाह रहा है कि सक्सेसफुल ट्रेडर्स बनने के लिए जो स्किल्स चाहिए वो स्किल्स एक ट्रेडर्स के अंदर नहीं है या फिर अलग अलग होती है दोनों सक्सेसफुल ट्रेडर और ट्रेडर के अंदर जो स्किल्स होती है वो डिफरेंट होती है as will be explained in a moment the learning process and the kind of a person transformation that was necessary to enable me to write this was distinctly different from the kind of learning process I experienced as a trader to realize why a book like this needed to be written. One learning process was chosen and the other was forced. What I mean by forced is I had to lose my house, my car, and practically everything as I owned to learn some of the ways in which I needed to change my perspective to operate in the trading environment effectively. Losing all my possessions was a complete life altering experience and the experience that taught me a lot about the nature of a fear and the debilitating effects it has on a person's ability to trade effectively. The kind of insight I gained as a result of this experience is the type of learning process I called forced awareness. This is where the nature and characteristics of the environment I was operating in were much different from what I believed they were. First, out of ignorance and because I put up a mental defenses to block my perception of certain information. Eventually, I was forced by the market to acknowledge many things about myself that I otherwise wouldn't considered when all the external symbols that represents a major part of my identity were gone. I didn't have any other choice and was forced to pursue myself in new and different ways. These events occurred in March 1982. At the time, I was an account executive with Merrill Lynch Commodities at its Chicago Board of Trade office. Less than a year before, in just 1981, I moved from the suburbs of Detroit, where I was enjoying, at least financially, a very successful career in commercial property and casually in insurance. I left Michigan and success to move to Chicago and be a trader. I went to work for Merrill Lynch because I didn't have enough money to buy a seat at the Board of Trade or the Chicago Mercantile Exchange and didn't know that you could lease seats at that time. I had an expensive apartment on the Gold Coast of Chicago and a Porsche. I was maintaining a house in an affluent suburb of Detroit that my girlfriend and her two daughters were living in, and I was driving or flying back and forth between the two cities almost every weekend to visit them. I was under extreme financial pressure to succeed because my lifestyle expenditures were far and away in excess of what I could afford. Unless I made it bigger as a trader, it would be very hard to reconcile some of the decisions I made to put myself in that kind of situation. By the time I moved to Chicago, I had already been trading for over 2 years. Twice before moving, I lost all my trading capital. Of course, I would quickly save up and start again. My brief periods of success and few winning trades were enough to justify that I continued trying. Once I was very close to making over a quarter of $1 million on a trade, but I pulled out of it just before the big move. These devastated me, but I also become completely hooked on trading and even more determined to be successful. From that experience, I decided to buy all the books I could get and attend all the seminar I could afford. Something stated in virtually all the books I read was that it is very difficult to learn how to trade or sustain any success if one is under a great deal of financial pressure, meaning don't expect to become a successful trader if you have a limited trading capital or if you are trading with money you can't afford to lose. I was obviously violating both these rules because I had very little trading capital relative to my lifestyle that I absolutely could not afford to lose. Also, I had a lot of other evidence that the odds were not exactly in my favor. I came to Chicago because I believed that if I could get closer to the actions and meet people who knew how to trade, I could then learn from them. I was in for a very rude reckoning. I was a Merrill Lynch Commodities, its second largest commodity office with 38 account executives. At first, I was shocked to find out only one of the account executives had an experience trading his own money. Then I was further shocked to learn that none of the account executives had any customers who were making any money. In fact, the typical customer lost his original stake within an average of 4 months. My next major disappointment came when I began to meet and make friends with as many floor traders as possible, believing that if the guy up in the offices don't know how to make money, the floor trader certainly must. Again, I found the same condition that existed up in the offices, other than a handful of floor trade who had a reputation and mistake that everyone seemed to be in awe of. I couldn't find one person who was making many decisions, who wasn't confused or knew what he wanted to do, and they did it without first having to ask everyone around him for confirmation that he has doing the right thing. I am not implying that I didn't meet traders who at some point in the day hadn't made money. They just couldn't keep it. I knew many traders who could make dollar to dollar in the first house trading, but they would always lose it back plus more or short time afterwards. Everybody seemed to be suffering from the same kind of problems and mistakes that nobody really recognizes problems. Obviously, the nature of the markets and makeup made it easy not to have to confront anything that otherwise might be perceived as a problem because the next trade always had the possibility of making everything else in one's life seem irrelevant. Why deal with anything if the next trade can make you rich? All the traders I knew, all the traders I knew, including myself, were affected by the types of a big trade mentality. In fact, my big trade affected by the type of my big trade mentally was so pervasive that I would refuse to take profits at $500 or $750 in many trades, even when I knew that that's all there was to be made. These may sound it's absurd, but I wouldn't take profits over such a small amounts because at the time it felt as if the market was insulting me by offering such paltry sums compared to what I needed or expected. As my financial problems grew, so did my desperation, and I certainly wasn't comforted by anything I saw going on around me, but I still held on the belief that I could get out of these difficulties. That is until March 1982. By then, it was all over. Mere 8 months after moving to Chicago to pursue my dreams of financial independence, I had nothing left except to my job, apartment, clothes, a television, and a bed. Practically overnight, almost all the symbols that validated my identity were gone. What I mean is, a big part of my self-concept was made up for my possessions, like my house, my car, and especially my credit, maintaining the flawless myself without any of these things as I have proud of. Now I found myself without any of these things as I have already pointed out. It's not as if there has hadn't been plenty of evidence to suggest the possibilities of this happening because there had been, but there was a part of me that wouldn't allow for a direct confrontation with this evidence or the implication. It was just too easy to make excuses for all the things going on around me that didn't add up. Refusing to confront or consider the implication of all with the conflicting information credited, created enough stress and to compound the situation. I had the intense fear that I would lose everything, but again I did everything possible to hide it in the fear and put it somewhere in my mind where I couldn't see it. And there must have been a part of me that sense my impending fall by years could I have been so confused with the fear, but how could I face any of these when I had no way of reconciling the imbalance that losing all of these things will create. What I mean is the imbalance between what I believed about myself and the things that validated these beliefs. So who would I be of after all these things were gone? Well, it didn't take me very long to find out as my financial conditions deteriorated to critical levels. My mental defenses also began to break down. I eventually accepted the inevitability of doing what I believed was the ultimate act of failure and build up for bankruptcy. There were a lot of things that changed the inside of me as a result of this experience, and I leave. And like anyone else forced to deal with major changes in his or her life, I learned a lot about myself. The first thing that happened, which was quite surprising, was that the stress dissipated, dissipated. I was overcome with a great sense of relief, with nothing to anticipate, read or try so desperately to defend again. Instead, I was living through my worst fear and found there really wasn't anything about the situation that I couldn't deal with. It wasn't nearly as bad in reality as I imagined it would be. I was still alive and healthy. I was able to think and function, and I started to appreciate my ability to think as my great asset. This sense of appreciation began to grow into a deeper level of understanding about the basic nature of my identity. For the most part, I grew up believing that who I was consisted of the things that made me. What I began to realize is that I was more than the things I had accumulated. When the facade was stripped away, it allowed me to sense this deeper dimension that up to this point I had only the slightest inkling of. This new awareness in turn helped me understand how being wrong and losing something didn't in any way diminish me as a person. I was beginning to learn that there was a certain freedom in granting myself permission to be wrong, and maybe there was no such thing as a failure unless something possible and useful isn't learned from the experience. However, I didn't relate these personal experiences because I thought they were particularly unusual, except for one. Everyone knows there are many leaders who lose everything they own, and even though some of them will come to the same kind of awarenesses about themselves, they wouldn't necessarily be able to do it as a trader. Considering the financial requirements. I too was not in a financial position to keep on trading, except that I still had my job at Merrill Lynch. In fact, for me, it was business as usual, as if nothing at all had happened. I certainly wasn't about to announce to my customers or anyone in the office that I had just filed for bankruptcy. My job as an accountant executive was one of the few things I had left. And as far as I was concerned, it depended on me being a good trader. Wait a minute. I think if कुछ कर रहा है शायद 9 spot. सीधी सी बात है भाई, ऊपर तो जाएगा ही नहीं। लिक्विडिटी लिया, सारा एफवीजीज है, उसका एंट्री बनाया। but चलो भाई, दिस इज द वन इलेवन फॉर मी दैट अल्टीमेटली लीडेड टू द शॉर्ट creation of info. I was fortunate enough to be able to keep on trading often order with my own money, while these minor psychological changes were taking place, putting me in a unique putting me in a unique psychological changes were taking a place, putting me in a unique psychology, putting me in a unique position to examine and study the various ways in which the condition of my inner psychological environment affected what I experienced in the after psychological environment. This relationship between inner and outer isn't always that apparent, but in this situation it was unacceptable. Inacceptable, inescapable. I learned that the markets offer the trader an opportunity to profit from price movement, and these movements are basically in a perpetual motion. It is an environment where the individual has the freedom to create his own results, unimpeded by many of the constraints that exist in everyday social life. These never-ending opportunities make the market perfect mirror of the trader's attitude. What the trader sees in that movement and what he can do about it, the markets have no control over. All the choices and all the power to turn these choices into experience resides in the mind of each trader. For example, if I pursued the market as a threat, afraid of what it might take away from me, it wasn't because the outside conditions were actually threatening me in some way. It became very apparent to me that my fear was the result of my inability to anticipate events or act in a way that most appropriately served my best interests. It was only the lack of trust I had in myself to do what needed to be done, and that was really afraid of. Furthermore, I discovered that my mental framework was structured to avoid losses at all the costs. And in my desperate attempts to do so, I actually created them. You can think of it this way. Hello. You can think of it this way. None of us had the mental capacity to be aware of everything going on in the environment at once. First, the mental capacity. The environmental information we focus our attention on out of all that exists will be the information that has the most importance to us. As we allocate more and more of our attention to certain kinds of information because of its importance, we are at the same time systematically excluding other types of information from our awareness. I created my losses instead of avoiding them simply because I was trying to avoid them. Instead of being positively focused on market information that was indicate the potential for opportunity, I was more concerned with information that validated that I feared the most. As a result, a great deal of market information pertaining to other possibilities and opportunities that existed in any one moment completely escaped my attention, passing me by. The only way I could have perceived these opportunities other than after the fact would have been to let go of whatever was causing me to divert my attention away from what was happening in the market now. I had no way of knowing what I was missing out on until my belief about the significance of losses and being wrong started changing. Once this shift in perspective occurred, I started to notice behavior characteristics of the market and relationships between those characteristics that I was otherwise totally oblivious to. At some point, I realized that because I had already lost everything, I really didn't have anything to fear, and as a result, I inadvertently learned one of the most important lessons to becoming a solution to how to accept a loss without any negative consequence, no guilt, anger, shame, or self punishment. How to accept a loss without any negative consequence, no guilt, anger, shame, or self punishment. As my fear of losing dissipated, I was seeing and experiencing a different market because I was different. It was It was as if someone had removed blinders, which I didn't know existed from my eyes. Up till then, my trading had always been affected to my fears. I didn't have the slightest notion of what it would be like to trade without fear, or that doing it was even possibly, and least of all, that it was in fact necessary to be successful. What also become very apparent to me was the extent to which all of my fears had effectively blocked me from understanding why it was so absolutely necessary to have some clearly defined trading and money management rules that must be followed. It was all starting to make sense. The more I followed my rules, the more I trusted myself. The more followed my rules, the more I trusted myself. The more I trusted myself, the more I could focus my attention on subtle relationships in the market behavior to learn new things about the market, helping me become a better trader. Eventually, I could gauge the positive effects these new attitudes had on my ability to shift my perspective and flow with the markets. The less I cared about whether or not I was wrong, the clearer things became, making it much easier to move in and out of positions, cutting my losses short to make myself mentally available to take the next opportunity. Cutting my losses short to make myself mentally available to take the next. By June 19, by June 1982, I was starting to make consistently money for my customers who relied on me for these their trades. Not a lot of money by most traders standard by, but a steady. I was having winning days that were turning into winning weeks and months. Then, sometime in August 1982, I thought of writing a book at the very least, developing a seminar to explain to other traders what I had discovered for myself. In the area of education, there was a definite void in the market. There really wasn't any material that addressed the trading psychology at a deep enough level of insight to effectively help someone understand why success was so elusive. I wrote this book to address what I believe in a critical need for people who want to trade the futures of stock markets to have an organized, systematic, step-by-step approach to learn the mental skill is necessary to accumulate wealth as a trader. The secret of this approach is learning a new thinking methodology. Why a new thinking methodology? Why a new thing? It is my intention in this chapter to demonstrate clearly how a typical social trading environment in all the familiar way. Guys, so थिंक गोल्ड का बाइंग अच्छा खासा था ऊपर। ये भी मैंने बदल दिया, देखो अभी सेल एंट्री का रेड आएगा, बाय एंट्री का ग्रीन आएगा, तो आपको भी प्रॉब्लम ना हो। तो गाइस तो मैं आता हूँ थोड़ी देर के अंदर। गोल्ड का बाइंग यहाँ तक है, उसका सेल बीटीसी का समझ नहीं आ रहा। गोल्ड का बाइंग ऊपर तक है, यहाँ तक कर सकते हो। चलो तो फिर गाइस मैं आता हूँ थोड़ी देर के अंदर। 1 घंटे में देखा जाए तो कोई ट्रेड नहीं बन रहा है, और 1 घंटे के हिसाब से कोई ट्रेड है ही नहीं। सो वेट करो, मैं आता हूँ फिर थोड़ी देर में। चलो गाइस, तो फिर स्ट्रीम मैं ऑफ करता हूँ यहाँ पे। तो कुछ भी दिख नहीं रहा है, इसलिए स्ट्रीम ऑफ कर रहा हूँ। और मैं फिर बताऊंगा कि क्या सीन है। अगर कुछ आएगा तो टेलीग्राम पे अपडेट कर दूंगा। ठीक है गाइस, स्टे ट्यून, स्टे सेफ, बाय बाय गाइस, बाय बाय।